In the euphoric years following African independence, 11 West African nations dared to dream of something unprecedented, a shared airline that would connect their countries, compete with European carriers, and symbolize African unity in the skies. Air Afrique emerged in 1961 as one of the most ambitious multinational ventures in aviation history, backed by Benin, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, Togo, and initially Cameroon. This wasn't just another airline startup. It was a political statement wrapped in aluminum wings, promising to break the stranglehold of colonial-era carriers and give Africa its own voice in international aviation. For 4 decades, Air Afrique would struggle against impossible odds, political interference, and the harsh realities of running a business across multiple sovereign nations with competing interests. The airline's founding story reads like a textbook case of post-colonial optimism meeting economic reality. Formed under the umbrella of the Union douanière et économique de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, Air Afrique received backing from Air France, which held a 34% stake and provided crucial technical expertise. The French connection was both blessing and curse. It gave the airline immediate credibility and operational knowledge, but also tied it to the interests of its former colonial power. The initial fleet consisted of 4 Sud Aviation caravels, French-built jets that could handle both regional African routes and longer international flights to Paris. Headquarters were established in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire's economic capital, with President Félix Houphouët-Boigny positioning his country as the airline's primary champion. The early routes connected major West African cities like Dakar, Abidjan, Lomé, and Cotonou, while establishing the crucial Paris link that would become the airline's most profitable route for decades. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Air Afrique expanded with the optimism of the African independence era. The airline added Douglas DC-8s for long-haul routes, extending service to New York in 1971, a symbolic achievement that put African aviation on the global map. By 1973, the carrier was serving 32 destinations across 4 continents, with a fleet that had grown to include Airbus A300s, making Air Afrique one of the early customers for European wide-body aircraft. The Paris-Abidjan route became a lifeline for the French business community in West Africa, while routes to Mecca served the region's Muslim pilgrimage traffic. Revenue peaked in the late 1970s when the airline carried over 1 million passengers annually and employed more than 4,000 people across its network. The carrier's distinctive red, white, and blue livery became a familiar sight at airports from Dakar to Dubai, and for a brief moment, it seemed the multinational dream might actually work. But behind the gleaming aircraft and expanding route network, fundamental problems were festering like tumors in the airline's corporate structure. The 11-nation ownership structure that seemed so promising on paper proved to be a management nightmare in practice. Each member country demanded routes to their capitals regardless of profitability, turning the airline into a political tool rather than a business enterprise. Ministers from member nations routinely interfered in operational decisions, demanding free tickets for government officials and insisting on hiring decisions based on nationality rather than qualifications. The airline was forced to maintain unprofitable domestic routes within member countries while being blocked from dropping loss-making destinations for political reasons. Staff levels ballooned to over 6,000 employees by the 1980s, with many positions created to satisfy political quotas rather than operational needs. Corruption became endemic, with fuel contracts, aircraft purchases, and even routine maintenance deals subject to kickbacks and political considerations. The 1980s brought a perfect storm of challenges that exposed every weakness in Air Afrique's structure. The debt crisis that swept through Africa devastated the economies of member nations, leaving them unable to contribute their share of the airline's capital requirements. Several countries, including Central African Republic and Chad, accumulated massive debts to the airline while demanding continued service to their capitals. Competition intensified dramatically as European carriers like Air France, Alitalia, and Sabena launched their own routes to West Africa, often with newer aircraft and better service standards. The rise of Ethiopian Airlines as a Pan-African carrier provided a stark contrast. Here was a single-nation airline that operated efficiently and profitably while serving much of the same market. Technical problems plagued the aging fleet, with aircraft frequently grounded for lack of spare parts or proper maintenance. A series of incidents, including a 1987 crash in Côte d'Ivoire that killed all 57 people aboard, damaged the airline's safety reputation and led to increased insurance costs. Financial hemorrhaging accelerated through the 1990s as Air Afrique lurched from crisis to crisis. The airline accumulated debts exceeding $300 million by the mid-1990s, with member governments owing an additional $200 million in unpaid contributions and ticket purchases. Fuel suppliers began demanding cash payments after the airline defaulted on credit arrangements, forcing humiliating situations where aircraft were detained at airports until bills were paid. The fleet shrank from a peak of 24 aircraft to just 12 by 1998, with many planes repossessed by leasing companies or grounded for maintenance issues. Employee morale collapsed as salaries went unpaid for months at a time, leading to strikes that further disrupted operations and drove away passengers. The airline's hub strategy fragmented as member countries pursued their own aviation policies. Senegal developed Air Senegal International as a national carrier, while other nations signed bilateral agreements with foreign airlines that bypassed Air Afrique entirely. Market share on the crucial Paris routes plummeted from over 50% in the 1970s to less than 20% by the late 1990s. Multiple restructuring attempts throughout the 1990s failed to address the airline's fundamental governance problems. A 1994 privatization effort collapsed when potential investors balked at taking on the massive debt burden and complex political structure. The World Bank and other international lenders provided emergency financing on condition that the airline implement radical reforms, but member governments consistently blocked meaningful changes that would reduce their political control. Air France gradually reduced its technical support and sold down its ownership stake, signaling the end of French confidence in the venture. A brief partnership with American investment firm Aga Khan's Group in the late 1990s promised $200 million in new capital, but the deal fell apart amid disputes over management control and route restructuring. The airline's last major aircraft acquisition came in 1996 with the lease of 2 Airbus A340s for long-haul routes. But even these modern jets couldn't overcome the systemic problems plaguing the carrier. The final years of Air Afrique read like a case study in corporate death throes. By 2000, the airline was operating with just 7 aircraft and had cut its route network to fewer than 20 destinations. The once proud carrier that had pioneered African aviation to New York was reduced to wet leasing aircraft from other airlines and canceling flights without notice. A desperate 2001 restructuring plan called for $150 million in fresh capital from member states, but only $30 million materialized as governments struggled with their own fiscal crises. The September 11th attacks delivered a final blow by devastating international travel demand, just as the airline was trying to rebuild its long-haul network. Insurance costs skyrocketed while passenger traffic plummeted, making the already impossible financial situation completely hopeless. On January 2, 2002, Air Afrique operated its final flight, ending 41 years of multinational aviation dreams with a whimper rather than a roar. The collapse of Air Afrique sent shockwaves through West African aviation and left thousands of employees without jobs or pensions. Aircraft were scattered across airports in Abidjan, Dakar, and Paris as creditors moved to seize assets, while passenger claims for unused tickets were largely written off as worthless. The airline's bankruptcy left a $500 million debt burden that took years to unravel, with disputes over aircraft ownership and route rights continuing long after operations ceased. Former employees staged protests in multiple countries as promised severance payments never materialized, and many veteran African pilots and mechanics were forced to seek work overseas. The failure also damaged West African aviation infrastructure, as several airports had invested heavily in facilities specifically for Air Afrique operations. Regional connectivity within West Africa, never strong to begin with, became even more fragmented as no single carrier stepped in to fill the void left by the multinational airline. The legacy of Air Afrique serves as both cautionary tale and inspiration for African aviation development. While the airline failed spectacularly, it did prove that African carriers could compete internationally when properly managed and adequately funded. The technical expertise developed by thousands of African aviation professionals during Air Afrique's 4 decades of operation helped seed other successful carriers across the continent. Several former Air Afrique pilots and engineers went on to leadership roles at airlines like Ethiopian, Kenya Airways, and South African Airways. The dream of Pan-African connectivity that motivated Air Afrique's founders has been partially realized by other carriers, though none have attempted the complex multinational ownership structure that ultimately doomed the West African pioneer. Today's successful African airlines like Ethiopian and Emirates have learned from Air Afrique's mistakes, focusing on single-nation ownership, professional management, and market-driven route decisions rather than political considerations. The story of Air Afrique reminds us that in aviation, as in life, good intentions and noble dreams must be backed by sound business practices and clear governance structures. Lessons written in the sky over West Africa and paid for with the dreams of 11 nations.